My friends, I want you to understand something very powerful today. Something that will change the way you see adversity, betrayal, and opposition. There is a divine law in operation. A law that cannot be broken. A law that says what they meant for evil, God will turn for your good. No matter who plotted against you, no matter what traps they set, no matter what lies they told, no matter how much they tried to stop you, God is turning their evil plans against them. You see, the problem with your enemies is that they think they have power over your destiny. They assume that because they have resources, influence, or numbers, they can bring you down. But what they fail to realize is that you are not standing on your own strength. You are not moving by your own wisdom. You are not protected by human hands. You are covered by the Most High God. And when God is for you, who can be against you? The Bible gives us example after example of people who were plotted against, lied on, mistreated, and abandoned, only for God to turn the entire situation around. Joseph's brothers threw him into a pit, sold him as a slave, and thought they had destroyed his dream. But they didn't know that their betrayal was the very thing that would position him for the palace. Haman built gallows to hang Mordecai. But God turned the plan around, and it was Haman who was hung on the very trap he set. The lions were ready to devour Daniel, but God shut their mouths. The fiery furnace was prepared to destroy the 3 Hebrew boys, but God walked in the fire with them. Every time the enemy planned evil, God reversed it. And I declare to you today, the same God who did it for them is the same God who is working on your behalf. The same God who turned the enemy's plans into stepping stones will turn what was meant to harm you into something that will bless you. You may be facing people who are digging ditches, trying to bury your name, trying to bring shame to your life. But the word of God says, whoever digs a pit will fall into it. Whoever rolls a stone, it will roll back on them. That means you don't have to fight them in your own strength. You don't have to seek revenge. You don't have to prove anything to anybody. Just stand still. God is a master at using the enemy's own weapons against them. Pharaoh thought he was chasing the Israelites to bring them back into slavery, but the Red Sea that was supposed to stop Israel became the very thing that drowned Pharaoh's army. The cross that was meant to destroy Jesus became the symbol of his greatest victory. Don't you see, the enemy always overplays his hand. He always thinks he has the upper hand, but God has already written the final chapter. Some of you have been crying because people betrayed you. You've been feeling abandoned because people turned their backs on you. But what if I told you that the rejection was part of God's plan? What if I told you that the lies they told are going to work in your favor? What if I told you that God allowed them to think they won just so he could set them up for a divine reversal? God is turning it around. He's reversing the arrows, confusing the enemy's camp, and setting the record straight. Stay in position, stay in faith. Keep your heart pure. Do not retaliate. Do not let bitterness take root in your heart. Your job is not to fight them. Your job is to trust him. Because when God fights for you, victory is inevitable. The very thing they use to destroy you will be the very thing that promotes you. The lie they told will be the reason your name is elevated. The trap they set will be the reason they fall. And in the end, you will look back and say, if God be for me, who can be against me? My friends, I want you to hear this deep in your spirit. There is no evil plan, no wicked scheme, no betrayal so great that God cannot turn it around for your good. It does not matter how powerful your enemies think they are, how many people conspire against you, or how impossible the situation looks. God is still in control. He is not intimidated by their threats. He is not shaken by their strategies. In fact, what they think is their victory is already being transformed into their downfall. What they meant to destroy you, God will use to elevate you. You must understand that when people plot against you, they are not just fighting you, they are fighting the God who called you. They are coming against the divine purpose that has been set over your life. And the moment they rise against you, they position themselves for divine judgment. When Pharaoh set himself against Israel, he thought he had control over their destiny. He believed he could oppress them, crush them, and break their spirit. But what Pharaoh did not realize was that he was working right into God's plan. every hardship, every burden, every act of oppression only made Israel stronger. And in the end, the Red Sea that Pharaoh thought would stop Israel became the very thing that drowned him and his army. That's how God operates. He allows the enemy to think he's winning, only to turn the tables at the right moment. Look at Joseph. His own brothers threw him into a pit, sold him into slavery, and thought they had destroyed his dream. But what they didn't know was that their betrayal was actually a divine setup. Every step Joseph took, from the pit to Potiphar's house, from prison to the palace, was leading him to his destiny. When he finally stood in power, second in command over Egypt, Joseph declared, "What you meant for evil, God turned for my good." That means no attack, no betrayal, no opposition can stop God's plan for your life. Some of you are crying over the things people have done to you. You are frustrated because you see people working against you, lying about you, trying to block you. But let me tell you, do not be discouraged. Do not be afraid, because God is using their own actions to propel you forward. What they are trying to use against you is the very thing God is using to build you. The more they push you down, the higher God will lift you up. The more they try to stop you, the greater your acceleration will be. So stop worrying about the enemy's plans. Stop giving energy to their schemes. Stop losing sleep over what they said. Instead, fix your eyes on God. He is the master strategist, the ultimate judge, the great deliverer. He has already written the end of your story. And the same people who thought they buried you will have to watch you rise. The same voices that mocked you will have to testify that God was with you all along. You don't have to fight them. You don't have to prove anything. You don't even have to defend yourself. Just stand still and watch what God does. Because when He moves, He does not just deliver you. He makes sure your enemies know that it was Him. He does not just bring you out. He brings you out with favor, with honor, and with a testimony that cannot be denied. So I declare to you today, what they meant for evil, God is turning for your good. The attack is becoming your testimony. The opposition is becoming your promotion. And when the dust settles, you will see that nothing and no one can stop the plan of God for your life. Too many people are living in fear because they believe that their enemies have power over their destiny. They look at the opposition, the betrayal, the rejection, and they assume that people can block what God has ordained for them. But let me remind you today, no man, no woman, no system, no force of darkness can cancel what God has already written concerning your life. Your enemies may try to delay you, but they cannot deny you. They may try to frustrate you, but they cannot stop the purpose of God from manifesting in your life. When God speaks over your life, His word is final. He does not need the approval of people. He does not require permission from your enemies. What He has declared, He will accomplish. And there is nothing the enemy can do about it. The problem with your enemies is that they assume they have control. They think that because they are in positions of influence, because they have more resources, or because they have gathered people against you, they can dictate your future. But what they don't know is that God is using them as part of His divine strategy. Look at David. King Saul hated him. He chased him, tried to kill him, and did everything in his power to stop him from becoming king. But what Saul didn't realize was that his attacks were actually pushing David closer to the throne. Every battle, every hardship, every moment of suffering was preparing David for his destiny. Saul thought he was destroying David, but he was only making him stronger. And when the time was right, God removed Saul, and David sat on the throne as the chosen king. Look at Jesus. His enemies plotted against him. The religious leaders thought that by crucifying him, they were putting an end to his influence. But they did not realize that the very cross they used to destroy him was the instrument of his greatest victory. What they thought was the end was actually the beginning of his greatest triumph. That is how God works. He allows the enemy to think he has won, only to turn the situation around for His glory. That means you don't have to be afraid of what people are plotting. You don't have to waste your energy trying to prove yourself. You don't have to fight battles that belong to God. Your job is to trust Him, to stay in faith, to remain obedient, because at the appointed time, He will elevate you in front of those who thought they had power over you. Some of you have been hurt by people who walked away. Some of you have been betrayed by those you trusted. Some of you have been lied on, rejected, and mistreated. But let me tell you something. The rejection was a blessing in disguise. The betrayal was a divine setup. The attack was part of your preparation. If they had not turned against you, you would not have moved into your next season. If they had not tried to harm you, you would not have grown stronger in your faith. If they had not tried to block you, you would not have seen the miraculous hand of God in your life. Do not fear their plans. Do not be discouraged by their actions. The only reason they are fighting you is because they see the anointing on your life. The only reason they are trying to stop you is because they recognize that God's hand is on you. But what they don't know is that the more they try to break you, the more God will use their own plans to build you. You don't need to manipulate situations. You don't need to seek revenge. You don't need to worry about what they are saying. Just stay faithful, because God is already working behind the scenes. The same people who thought they had the power to destroy you will soon have to admit that you were unstoppable all along. And when you step into the place God has prepared for you, you will look back and say, it was good that they fought me, because they only pushed me into my destiny. All throughout history, we see a powerful truth. When the enemy rises up against God's people, God does not just defend them, He uses the very attack to fulfill His purpose. The Bible is filled with examples of divine reversals, moments where what was meant for destruction became a stepping stone for elevation. Think about Joseph. His own brothers conspired against him, threw him into a pit, and sold him into slavery. They thought they had destroyed his future. They believed they had silenced his dream. But what they didn't realize was that they were not killing his destiny. They were activating it. If Joseph had never been sold, he would have never entered Potiphar's house. If he had never been falsely accused, he would have never been sent to prison. And if he had never been sent to prison, he would have never met the man who would introduce him to Pharaoh. In one moment, Joseph went from being a prisoner to being the prime minister of Egypt. And when his brothers finally stood before him, afraid that he would take revenge, Joseph looked at them and said, "You meant it for evil, but God turned it for my good." The very plan they used to destroy him was a plan God used to elevate him. That is the kind of God we serve. He does not just rescue His children, He makes sure that the enemy's attack becomes part of their testimony. Look at Mordecai and Haman. Haman was a wicked man who hated Mordecai and plotted to have him destroyed. He went so far as to build a gallows specifically for Mordecai, preparing for the day he would see him executed. But what Haman did not realize was that God was watching. The very gallows that were built to destroy Mordecai became the instrument of Haman's own downfall. The trap he set for someone else ended up being his own destruction. That is how God operates. He lets the enemy believe he is in control, only to flip the script at the appointed time. That is why you do not need to panic when you see people plotting against you. That is why you do not need to be afraid when the enemy comes against you, because history has already shown us that when the enemy thinks he has won, he is actually sealing his own defeat. Think about Daniel. He was thrown into the lion's den because of the evil plots of jealous men. They conspired, they manipulated, they used deception to get him thrown into the pit. But what happened? God shut the mouths of the lions, and the next morning the king himself had those same wicked men thrown into the den, where they were devoured instantly. What does that tell you? The trap they set for Daniel became their own destruction. The lions that were supposed to kill Daniel ended up consuming his enemies. And then we come to Jesus, the greatest example of all. The enemy thought that by nailing Jesus to the cross, he had won. The religious leaders mocked him, the Roman soldiers crucified him, and even his disciples thought it was over. But what they did not understand was that the cross was not a defeat. It was a setup. The very thing the enemy used to destroy Jesus became the instrument of salvation for the entire world. 3 days later, he rose with all power in his hands, proving once and for all that no evil plan can stop the will of God. I don't know what you are facing today. I don't know what traps the enemy has set against you, but I do know this. God has a history of turning evil plans against the enemy. And if he did it before, he will do it again. The same God who rescued Joseph, the same God who reversed Haman's plot, the same God who raised Jesus from the dead, the same God is working in your life right now. So stand firm. Do not be moved. The enemy may think he has the upper hand, but God is about to flip the script. And when it's all said and done, you will not only survive, you will come out victorious, promoted, and positioned for greater things. There is something powerful about the way God operates. He does not just protect his people. He makes sure that everything the enemy intended for harm is turned into something good. When people plot against you, when they try to sabotage you, when they set traps in your path, they think they are winning. They think they are in control. But what they fail to realize is that they are only positioning themselves for their own downfall. Because the God you serve does not just defend you, he reverses the attack and uses it to bless you. This is why you must not panic when you hear of people working against you. This is why you must not retaliate when others seek to harm you. Because the battle is not yours. It belongs to the Lord. And when God fights for you, he does not just deliver you, he makes sure your enemies know that they touched the wrong person. When God moves, he does not just protect you. He uses the attack to advance you. What was meant to break you becomes the very thing that builds you. Take a moment and think about the story of Moses and the Israelites. Pharaoh thought he had complete control over them. He enslaved them, oppressed them, and refused to let them go. Even when God sent plagues, Pharaoh hardened his heart. But when the time came for Israel to be free, not only did God deliver them, but he also made sure they left Egypt with wealth. The same people who oppressed them were commanded to give them silver, gold, and fine clothing. And when Pharaoh tried one last time to stop them at the Red Sea, God did something incredible. He opened the sea for his people to cross, and then he used the same sea to destroy Pharaoh and his army. The very thing that was supposed to trap Israel became the weapon that eliminated their enemy. This is why you must not fear when the enemy rises against you. This is why you must not give in to the temptation of fighting battles in your own strength. Look at Job. Satan thought that if he could take everything from Job, he would curse God and turn away from his faith. But Job remained steadfast. And in the end, not only did God restore what Job lost, but he doubled it. What was meant to destroy Job ended up elevating him to greater blessings. Look at Paul. He was thrown into prison for preaching the gospel. The enemy thought he had silenced Paul. But what happened? From that prison, Paul wrote letters that became part of the New Testament. The very attempt to stop him became the reason his word spread across the world. What the enemy meant for evil, God turned for good. So what does that mean for you? It means you must not allow fear to control you. It means you must not waste time worrying about what people are saying or doing behind your back. Instead, you must remain steadfast in your faith because God is already orchestrating your victory. The people who lied about you will have to watch as you walk through doors that they never imagined would open for you. God is not just bringing you out. He is bringing you out with favor. He is not just rescuing you, he is elevating you. And when all is said and done, you will look back and realize that every attack, every betrayal, every hardship was only a stepping stone to something greater. So stand still and watch, because what the enemy planned for evil, God is turning for your good. Many times, when people come against us, when they plot, when they scheme, when they attempt to destroy what God is doing in our lives, we feel the urge to respond. We want to defend ourselves. We want to fight back. But what if I told you that the best thing you can do is to stay still and let God fight for you? Because the truth is, When God fights your battles, He doesn't just protect you, He makes an open spectacle of your enemies. He makes sure that those who planned your downfall become witnesses to your rise. Think about this. When people attack you, they assume that they are controlling your outcome. They assume that their lies, their betrayal, their manipulation will determine your future. But what they don't realize is that they are not fighting against you. They are fighting against the one who called you. And when you are walking in divine purpose, no attack can stop you, because God Himself becomes your defender. Look at Daniel. His enemies conspired against him not because he did anything wrong, but because they were intimidated by his favor. They tricked the king into signing a decree that made it illegal to pray to any god except the king. But Daniel did not panic. He did not try to plead his case. He did not even try to hide his faith. He simply remained faithful to God. And what happened? He was thrown into the lion's den. His enemies celebrated, thinking that they had won. But the very thing that was supposed to destroy Daniel became the thing that elevated him. Because God stepped in. He shut the mouths of the lions. He preserved Daniel. And the next morning, the very men who had plotted against him were thrown into the same lion's den, and they were the ones who were destroyed. The same thing happened with the 3 Hebrew boys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They refused to bow to an idol, and the king had them thrown into a fiery furnace. But God did not allow the fire to consume them. Instead, He walked with them in the fire. He preserved them. And when they stepped out, not even the smell of smoke was on them. And what happened next? The king who had sentenced them to death was forced to acknowledge the power of their God. And the same people who threw them into the fire had to stand and watch as God elevated them. This is what God does. He does not just rescue His children. He makes sure that their enemies witness their deliverance. He makes sure that those who try to bury you have to watch as you rise. He makes sure that those who falsely accuse you have to acknowledge that His hand is on your life. This is why you must never waste your energy fighting unnecessary battles. This is why you must not be distracted by people who speak against you. This is why you must not be distracted by people who speak against you. Because if you stay faithful, if you keep your focus on God, He will handle everything for you. He will prepare a table for you in the presence of your enemies. He will make sure that the ones who doubted you will have to acknowledge that God was with you all along. You don't need to chase after revenge. You don't need to justify yourself. You don't need to prove anything to anyone. Just remain in alignment with God's purpose and watch as He turns every evil plan against itself. Watch as He takes what was meant for your destruction and transforms it into your elevation. When you walk with God, your enemies do not have the final say. God does. And He is about to make sure that the very ones who thought they defeated you will have to watch as He blesses you in ways they never imagined. Stay in faith, because your vindication is coming. One of the greatest mistakes the enemy makes is underestimating the power of God's plan for your life. The enemy thinks that by attacking you, by setting traps, by orchestrating schemes, he can stop what God is doing. But what the enemy does not understand is that every attack he sends your way is only accelerating God's purpose in your life. What was meant to break you is actually building you. What was meant to destroy you is positioning you for greater things. Look at Jesus. The enemy thought that by crucifying Him, He had won. The religious leaders believed they had silenced Him. The soldiers believed they had put an end to His mission. Even the disciples thought it was over. But what they did not understand was that the crucifixion was part of the plan. The cross was not the end. It was the process. The suffering was not the defeat. It was the setup. And 3 days later, Jesus rose from the grave with all power in His hands, proving once and for all that no weapon formed against Him could prosper. This is why you cannot be shaken by adversity. This is why you must not lose heart when people rise up against you. Because every attack is pushing you closer to your destiny. Every betrayal is aligning you with God's purpose. Every setback is preparing you for a greater comeback. You are not losing. You are being positioned. You are not defeated. You are being developed. Think about David. Before he ever became king, he had to face giants, endure betrayal, and run for his life. Saul, the very man he once honored, turned against him. Saul tried everything to destroy him. He chased him, hunted him, and even plotted to kill him. But what happened? Every attempt to destroy David only made him stronger. Every battle prepared him for the throne, and when the time came, the very kingdom Saul tried to keep away from him was handed to him by divine order. This is why you cannot allow fear to control your heart. The enemy is not in charge of your destiny. God is. People are not in charge of your future. God is. And no matter what they plot, no matter what they plan, no matter what they do, they cannot override what God has already set in motion. Joseph's brothers thought they had destroyed his dream, but their betrayal only set him on the path to his destiny. Haman thought he had eliminated Mordecai, but his own plan became his downfall. The lions were meant to devour Daniel, but they became his testimony. The fire was supposed to consume the Hebrew boys, but it became their platform for promotion. Every attack, every hardship, every opposition became the very thing that revealed God's power. And the same God who turned those situations around is the same God working in your life right now. The same God who reversed the enemy's plans for them is the same God who will do it for you. This is why you cannot waste time worrying about who is against you. This is why you must not let fear consume you. Because what the enemy meant for evil, God is already turning for your good. So stand firm in faith. Keep pressing forward. Do not be discouraged by what you see, because while the enemy is plotting, God is planning. While the enemy is scheming, God is positioning. And when the time comes, everything that was meant to stop you will be the very thing that launches you into your destiny. You are not just surviving this season. You are being prepared for something greater. And when it is all said and done, your enemies will have no choice but to acknowledge that God's hand has been on your life all along. One of the most powerful truths in life is this: when you are walking in divine purpose, no attack can stop you. No betrayal can derail you. No scheme of the enemy can undo what God has already ordained for your life. The enemy may think he is setting you up for failure, but in reality, he is setting you up for elevation. What was meant to harm you is about to be used as the very thing that lifts you. Joseph understood this truth when his own brothers plotted against him, when they threw him into a pit, when they sold him into slavery. They thought they had destroyed his dream. They believed they had removed him from the possibility of greatness. But what they didn't know was that their betrayal was the very thing that placed him on the road to his destiny. If Joseph had never been sold, he would have never entered Potiphar's house. If he had never been falsely accused, he would have never been thrown into prison. And if he had never been in prison, he would have never met the man who would later introduce him to Pharaoh. Every single step, every hardship, every injustice, every trial was not a detour, but a divine setup. By the time Joseph stood before his brothers years later, he could boldly say, "What you meant for evil, God turned for good." The same people who tried to bury him had to bow before him. The same people who rejected him had to come to him for help. This is what happens when you trust God's process. This is what happens when you refuse to let bitterness and fear take root in your hearts. This is why you must not panic when people work against you. This is why you must not waste your energy trying to prove yourself to those who have rejected you. Because when God's hand is on your life, every setback is a setup. Every obstacle is an opportunity. Every attack is an announcement that something greater is about to be revealed. Look at the story of Esther. Haman, the enemy of God's people, was determined to destroy the Jews. He built gallows, expecting to execute Mordecai, a faithful servant of God. But what happened? The same gallows that Haman built for Mordecai became the very place of his own destruction. The enemy's trap turned against him. This is what happens when God fights for you. He does not just protect you. He reverses the plan. He makes sure that the same pit your enemies dug for you is the one they fall into. This is why you must not retaliate in your own strength. You must not lower yourself to the level of those who plot against you. Because God is working behind the scenes. And when He moves, He will make sure that everything meant to harm you turns into the very thing that blesses you. David was only a shepherd boy when Goliath came against Israel. The giant mocked, ridiculed, and threatened him, but David did not fear because he knew that the battle was the Lord's. And what happened? Goliath's own sword became the instrument of his defeat. The very weapon he carried to destroy David was used to cut off his own head. You must understand that when God is on your side, no attack against you can succeed. The very people who try to destroy your reputation will have to watch as God elevates you. The very ones who try to block your opportunities will have to witness doors opening that they could never shut. This is why you must stay faithful. This is why you must stay focused, because when God moves, He does not just deliver you. He makes sure that your enemies see His hand on your life. He makes sure that those who worked against you become witnesses to your victory. And when it is all said and done, they will have no choice but to acknowledge that the God you serve is mighty. So do not be discouraged, do not be afraid, because what they meant for evil, God is already turning for your good. The greatest evidence that God is working in your life is not the absence of opposition, but the resilience you develop in the midst of it. When the enemy plots against you, when people try to destroy your name, when obstacles arise to block your progress, do not be discouraged. Because what the enemy does not realize is that his very attack is becoming the training ground for your promotion. The enemy thinks he is weakening you, but God is using the process to strengthen you. The trials you are facing are not meant to destroy you. They are meant to refine you, to sharpen you, to prepare you for the next level. Look at Daniel. He was faithful, he was excellent, and he was favored by God. But that favor made him a target. His enemies plotted against him. They manipulated the king, and they orchestrated a law designed specifically to trap him. They thought that by throwing him into the lion's den, they could silence him. They thought they could destroy his influence, remove his authority, and put an end to his favor. But what happened? The very thing they designed to destroy him became the greatest testimony of his life. God did not prevent Daniel from being thrown into the lion's den, but He did shut the mouths of the lions. He did not stop the enemy's plan from being set in motion, but He did turn it around for Daniel's good. By the next morning, Daniel was not only alive, he was promoted. And the same king who was tricked into signing the law had to acknowledge the power of Daniel's God. This is what happens when you trust God in the middle of opposition. This is what happens when you refuse to fear the enemy's plans. God does not always remove the battle, but He does guarantee your victory. He does not always prevent the storm, but He does promise that you will come out of it unharmed. And when it is all said and done, the people who tried to destroy you will have to witness your elevation. The same was true for the 3 Hebrew boys. They refused to bow. They refused to compromise. And because of that, the enemy turned the heat up. He did not just throw them into the fire. He made sure it was 7 times hotter. But what he did not know was that God was already in the fire, waiting for them. The enemy expected them to be consumed, but instead, they were walking freely in the flames. The very thing that was meant to destroy them became the platform for God's glory. When they stepped out of the fire, not a hair on their heads was burned. Not even the smell of smoke was on them. And the same king who threw them in had to decree that their God was the only true God. This is why you must not fear when people rise against you. This is why you must not panic when you see the enemy's plans unfolding, because God is already 10 steps ahead. He is not only preserving you, He is positioning you. The enemy thinks he is setting you up for failure, but he is only pushing you closer to your destiny. Every trial, every attack, every betrayal is nothing more than God's process of refining you, strengthening you, and preparing you for what He has already planned. So do not be discouraged. Do not waste time worrying about who is against you. Do not let fear control your decisions. Because what they meant for evil, God is already turning for your good. The fire will not consume you. The lions will not harm you. The trap they set will not succeed. And in the end, you will stand as a living testimony that no weapon formed against you shall prosper. Keep trusting, keep standing, because your victory is already secured. The beauty of God's power is that He does not just deliver you from the enemy's plans, He uses those very plans to elevate you. The enemy may think he is pushing you down, but in reality, he is setting you up to rise higher. This is why you must never fear opposition. You must never be intimidated by those who conspire against you, because the more they plot, the more they push you into your divine assignment. Look at Jesus. The religious leaders thought they had won when they conspired to have him crucified. They schemed, they lied, they manipulated the system to make sure he was nailed to the cross. They mocked him, they humiliated him. They thought they had destroyed him. But what they did not realize was that the very cross they used to kill him was the instrument God used to save the world. The very thing they designed to end his influence became the foundation of his eternal kingdom. And 3 days later, he rose with all power in his hands. This is how God works. He does not just defeat the enemy, he makes a public spectacle of him. He turns the very thing meant for your destruction into the platform for your victory. That is why you must not be discouraged when people rise against you. That is why you must not allow the attacks of the enemy to shake your faith. Because what they mean for evil, God is turning into your testimony. Think about Paul and Silas. They were arrested, beaten, and thrown into prison, not because they had done anything wrong, but because they were fulfilling their divine assignment. The enemy thought he had silenced them. The enemy thought he had locked them away. But what happened? In the middle of the night, in the darkest hour, Paul and Silas began to worship. They did not complain. They did not panic. They did not fear. They praised God right there in the prison. And suddenly, the ground began to shake. The prison doors flung open. Their chains fell off. And not only were they set free, but the jailer himself fell to his knees and gave his life to Christ. The attack was never about Paul and Silas. It was about the souls God wanted to save. The prison was never a place of punishment. It was a place of purpose. If they had not been thrown into that prison, that jailer and his entire household would have never encountered the gospel.